70,000 years ago, someone knelt beside a body, and they didn't have to kneel because the person was already dead, and there was nothing practical about what happened next, because no survival advantage waited there, and no caloric benefit and no reason at all. But they dug a hole anyway, and they placed the body inside with care, and they positioned the arms as if the dead person was sleeping, and they scattered red ochre over the skin like rust-coloured snow, falling in a cave where the sun never reached, and then they covered it all with dirt and walked away in silence. And that moment is the oldest mystery in human history, because it wasn't fire, and it wasn't tools, and it wasn't language, and it wasn't building, and it wasn't farming, and it was something much stranger, because burial is the ultimate paradox that makes no sense. And yet it happened and happened again and again, for tens of thousands of years, before civilization, and before religion, and before anyone could write down why they were doing it. So we are, left with only the bones and the red ochre, and the careful arrangement of the dead, and the question that echoes through time like a voice calling from the bottom of a grave, asking, what were you thinking? And what made you spend your energy and time on something that gave you nothing back except perhaps the burden of knowing that you too would die one day? Not fire, not tools, not language, burial. That is where we begin. Every other early human behaviour has a survival explanation, and that is the fundamental truth that makes this moment so strange. Because tools mean you hunt better, and fire means you cook food more efficiently, and language means you coordinate with others, and build societies and survive longer and pass on knowledge and have children who have more children, but burial means nothing except everything. And this is the paradox that keeps us awake at night thinking about our ancestors and what was inside their minds that made them perform rituals for the dead, even though the dead could not see and could not eat and could not help them hunt, or gather or defend against danger. So something else was driving it, and something inside was different from the animals around them. And the question is, what was it? And that question is the beginning of this journey into the deepest mystery of human consciousness and human time. Think about what you would need to do if you wanted to bury someone in the world 70,000 years ago, because you had no shovels and you had no metal, and you had nothing but stones and sticks and your own hands, and you would have to dig into hard earth with whatever tools you could create, and your hands would bleed and your back would ache, and you would have to gather those materials and transport them, and the body itself would grow heavy, and the smell would be overwhelming, and insects would gather and predators would be drawn to the scent of death, and you would be vulnerable while you were digging and while you were arranging the body and while you were covering it with earth and soil. And yet people did this repeatedly, and they did it not just once, but as a standard practice across different regions and different groups, which suggests that the motivation was deep and strong and not easily dismissed as accident or coincidence. The energy expenditure was real and significant, and in a world where food was scarce and survival was precarious, any activity that did not directly contribute to feeding yourself or your family would be a luxury and a cost, and yet people chose to pay that cost and chose to spend their limited time and strength on treating the dead with ceremony and care, which tells us that the psychological or spiritual motivation must have been powerful, because it overcame practical concerns and it became a priority worth the sacrifice, worth the effort, worth the blisters on hands and the exhaustion in muscles and the risk of being caught defenseless by predators while engaged in this strange and unprofitable activity. But here's the part that changes everything. The evidence we have is not just recent, because scientists have found burial sites that go back so far that they predate agriculture, and they predate cities, and they predate written language, and they predate anything we would call organized religion in the modern sense. And so the question becomes, when did this start, and why did it start, and what does it tell us about the human mind, when it was first forming, and when it was still wild, and when it was still learning what it meant to be human, and to know that you would die, and that others would die, and that the people you loved would leave you one day, and you would be left alone with nothing but the memory of their face, and their voice, and the way they moved through the world. Imagine if you lived in a time before recorded history and before writing, and before anyone had even thought to create a permanent record of anything, because memory was all you had and stories were how you passed knowledge down, and when someone died, that person took with them all the knowledge they had acquired in their lifetime and all the experiences and all the moments that made them who they were, and all of that would vanish like smoke if you did not have some way to mark their passing, and to create a ritual that acknowledged that something significant had been lost, and that the world was smaller without them, and that they deserved to be remembered even if only in the silence of the earth. The earliest definitive evidence comes from places like Qafzeh Cave in Israel, where archaeologists found burials dated to around 100,000 years ago, And these were Homo sapiens, modern humans, and they showed signs of intentional burial with red ochre and shell offerings placed carefully beside the dead. And these were not accidents, and they were not natural processes, and they were deliberate choices made by people who understood that something significant was happening when someone died, and that the body should be treated differently than garbage, and differently than the carcass of an animal they had hunted, because the dead person was one of them, and that meant something, and that meant everything. And the proof is written in ochre and shell and in the careful positioning of the bones that archaeologists can still read thousands of years later, like a letter left behind on stone. You have to consider what this means at the most basic level, because modern humans were burying their dead with ritual objects and with pigments that must have been gathered from somewhere and brought to the cave and carefully applied to the body, which means someone took time to gather red ochre specifically for this purpose, and thought it was important enough to spend energy on. And that speaks to the value placed on the dead person, and on the ritual itself, and on whatever meaning the ochre held, because colours in the human mind are never neutral. And red, especially red, was never just a colour to humans, and it still is not. And red is the colour of blood and of life, and of vitality, and to cover a dead body in red ochre is to make a statement about what you believe about death and what you believe about the person lying there, and what you believe happens to them after their breath stops. And perhaps the red ochre was meant to restore the life colour to a body that had grown pale and cold, and perhaps it was meant to keep the person warm in whatever realm they had entered, or perhaps it was simply a way of saying this person mattered, and their death is significant enough to mark with colour and with ceremony, and to remain visible and to remain remembered through the colour that will not fade and that will persist for thousands of years, and that will still be visible to anyone who finds the grave and examines the bones. Skull Cave in the same region also shows evidence of intentional burial practices going back nearly 100,000 years, and these sites represent a shift in human consciousness that is almost impossible to overstate, because before this moment in the archaeological record there is little evidence of this kind of ritual treatment of the dead, and after this moment it becomes a constant across human populations from different continents and different climates and different levels of technological sophistication. And so something changed in the human mind, and that change was captured in the careful placement of bodies in caves, and the use of red ochre, which is a mineral that seems to have had symbolic meaning beyond its practical properties, and the inclusion of objects like shells and stones and bone tools that suggest the dead were being sent somewhere, or prepared for something beyond mere physical decomposition. The shells are particularly interesting because shells do not occur naturally in caves, and they had to be transported there deliberately, which means someone walked to where the shells were found, and selected specific ones, and brought them back to the burial site and placed them with the dead, and that is a two-step symbolic act. First, the recognition that shells were worth collecting, and second, the decision to place them with the dead, which means shells held meaning, and they held enough meaning that they were worth the effort of transport and placement, and that they were believed to have some function or significance in the death ritual, and perhaps they were thought to help the dead person in whatever came next, or perhaps they were offerings or gifts for the journey, or perhaps they held symbolic meaning that we cannot now recover, but that once was as clear to the people performing the burial as day, and the ritual objects that accompany the dead often tell us more about what the living believed than anything else we can uncover from the archaeological record. When you hold a shell in your hand and think about why someone 100,000 years ago would carry it miles from the ocean and place it in a grave with their dead, you are touching a thought that has travelled across 100,000 years of time, and you are part of an unbroken chain of humans trying to understand what death means, and trying to mark it in ways that feel appropriate, and trying to send messages to people they loved even after those people could no longer respond. And in that moment holding that shell, you realise that humans have always been trying to communicate with the dead, and that this impulse goes back so far that it predates everything we think of as civilization, and everything we think of as religion, and everything we think of as culture, because it is something deeper than all of those things, and it is something in the human heart that says you meant something to us, and we refuse to let you go without acknowledgement, without ritual, without marking your death as the significant event that it was. Even more startling is the evidence of Neanderthal burials, because Neanderthals were not Homo sapiens, and they lived before modern humans arrived in Europe, and yet they too buried their dead with apparent intentionality, and this suggests that something in the Neanderthal mind also understood the significance of death and the need to treat the dead differently. And the most famous case is Shanidar Cave in Iraq, where archaeologists found a Neanderthal skeleton that seemed to be surrounded by pollen from flowers, which led to theories that flowers had been placed with the dead as some kind of funeral practice, and the debate still rages among scientists because some argue that the pollen was introduced naturally by wind or insects over time, and that it does not necessarily indicate that Neanderthals were placing flowers as grave goods, but other scientists maintain that the concentration of pollen is too high to be accidental, and that it represents evidence of a flower burial ceremony that suggests Neanderthals had the capacity for symbolic thought and emotional attachment to the dead, and the willingness to engage in acts that served no practical purpose other than to honour and remember the person who had died. The image of a Neanderthal placing flowers on a grave is so compelling that it has lodged itself in popular imagination, and in textbooks and in documentaries, because flowers are delicate and they serve no practical purpose, and to gather flowers and place them on the body of the dead is to engage in an act that is entirely about meaning and emotion and beauty and nothing to do with survival or function. And if Neanderthals did this, then they too understood the power of symbol and the importance of honouring the dead in ways that transcended basic biology, and that had to do with feeling and with love and with the recognition that death was significant and worthy of ceremony. And this changes how we think about Neanderthals because it suggests they were not the brutish creatures portrayed in so many depictions, but rather beings capable of abstract thought and aesthetic appreciation and emotional depth. At La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France, archaeologists found an old Neanderthal man who suffered from severe arthritis, and his bones show evidence that he was cared for during his lifetime because his teeth were worn down in a way that suggests he could no longer chew, and yet his body was robust and his bones show no signs of malnutrition, which means that others must have prepared food for him and fed him and supported him, even though he was no longer a productive member of the group, and he could not hunt or gather, and he could only consume resources while contributing nothing in return, and yet he was kept alive. And when he finally died, he was buried in a deliberate pit, with his body arranged in a specific way that suggests ritual care. And this tells us something profound about Neanderthal society, and about the bonds that connected these ancient people to one another, and about the capacity for compassion that existed in their minds, despite their smaller brains and their different anatomy, and the fact that they chose to care for this elderly man, and then to bury him suggests that he held value in the eyes of his community that could not be measured in terms of hunting prowess or strength, or the ability to contribute to survival. And that value must have been something else, something to do with who he was and the relationships he held and the knowledge he carried and the place he held in the hearts of his people. This is the pattern that matters because it shows that the old Neanderthal man was valued not for what he could produce, but simply for who he was, and that his community chose to support him through his disability and his uselessness, and that they chose to honour him in death, which reveals a society built on something other than pure utility. And this contradicts old views of Neanderthals as brutish and simple-minded, and instead suggests that they had emotional depths and social structures that were sophisticated enough to value individuals beyond their economic output, and to care for the vulnerable in their midst, and to mourn their passing in ways that required energy and ritual, and intentional action that had nothing to do with survival, and everything to do with love and connection and the bonds that held their communities together. More controversial, but perhaps even more significant, is the discovery of Homo naledi in the Rising Star Cave in South Africa, where scientists found hundreds of bones from a small-brained hominin species that lived hundreds of thousands of years ago, and the distribution of the bones and the depth at which they were found in the cave suggests that these bodies were deliberately deposited in the cave in what may be the earliest evidence of intentional treatment of the dead. And if this interpretation is correct, then we must push back the origins of death rituals by hundreds of thousands of years and recognize that the impulse to mark death with ritual and to dispose of the dead in meaningful ways goes back much deeper into human evolutionary history than we previously thought, and that it is not a modern invention or a cultural practice that emerged recently, but rather something fundamental to the human species, and perhaps even to our earlier cousins on the evolutionary tree, and that at some point in our deep past something awakened in the minds of our ancestors, something that made them understand their own mortality, and that made them want to respond to death not with indifference, but with intention and meaning and ceremony that would be remembered and that would matter to those who came after them. These discoveries raise the most profound questions about human consciousness and what it means to be human, because they show that the capacity to grieve and to mark death with ritual does not require civilization and does not require written language, and does not require organized religion, and does not even require a large brain. And if Neanderthals with their smaller skulls could perform these rituals, then the impulse must come from something primal and something deep within the structure of human consciousness itself, and something that connects us to these ancient people across the gulf of hundreds of thousands of years and allows us to recognize ourselves in their actions, even though we know almost nothing about what they were thinking or what they believed about the world, or what kinds of thoughts moved through their minds. The question of why burial emerged so early and so consistently is the question of human self-awareness, because at some point our ancestors looked at a dead body and understood that it had once been a person, and that person had thoughts and feelings and relationships, and that the death of that person meant something to everyone who had known them, and that the loss was real and profound and permanent. And this understanding is the beginning of consciousness itself, because once you understand that you are mortal and that everyone you love is mortal, then you understand the meaning of time and the meaning of loss and the meaning of love and the meaning of community. And all of those understandings flow from the same root, which is the knowledge that death exists and is final and affects everyone equally, and does not care about your strength or your intelligence or your ability to make tools or use fire. You cannot have true language without this knowledge, because language is built on the ability to represent things that are not present, and to reference things that no longer exist, and to speak about abstract concepts like mortality and loss and meaning. And so burial and language are intimately connected, because both require the capacity to think beyond the immediate moment, and to think about things that are not in front of you, and things that exist only in the mind. And it is possible that burial came before language, or at least developed in parallel with language, because both represent the human ability to create meaning and to mark significance, and to communicate across the gulf of death and distance and time. The evidence suggests that when humans first became aware of their own mortality, they did not respond with despair or indifference, but with ritual and with creativity, and with the desire to make the death of a person into something more than just the absence of a body, and the loss of a voice, and the loss of a presence in the group, and instead they took that moment of loss and transformed it into something that could bind the living together, and that could express their love and their sadness and their recognition that something significant had happened, and that something significant had been lost. Think about the mind of someone standing at the grave of a person they loved, and think about what would move them to kneel in the dirt and position the dead body carefully, and gather red ochre from somewhere else, and bring it to the cave and scatter it over the body and then cover it all with earth, and walk away knowing that they would never see this person again, and that they would have to live with that absence for the rest of their lives. And that knowledge would shape everything that came after, because they would now live in a world that was smaller and sadder and less full than the world they had lived in before. And yet they chose to perform this ritual anyway, and they chose to spend their energy on this act of devotion to someone who could no longer receive it, and could no longer know that they were being honoured and being remembered. These discoveries from archaeology are telling us something that we have always known in our hearts, but that we have never been able to prove, and now we have the proof, written in bone and in stone and in the careful arrangement of ancient graves. And the proof is this, that humans have always responded to death with love and with ritual, and with the desire to create meaning, and that this impulse goes back so far that it precedes everything we think of as human culture, and everything we think of as religion, and everything we think of as civilization, and that it is the foundation upon which everything else is built. Because once you have the ability to mark death with ceremony, then you have the beginning of belief systems, and you have the beginning of social structures, and you have the beginning of ethics, and you have the beginning of everything that makes us human. The real story here is not about religion at all, because these burials predate religion by tens of thousands of years, and they predate anything we would call a formal belief system, and they predate priests and temples and holy texts and sacred ceremonies, and yet they are ceremonies, and they are sacred in their own way, and they are a form of belief because they express a belief that death is significant, and that the dead person deserves to be honoured, and that their memory deserves to be preserved in the hearts of the living, and that the bonds of family and community survive even death, and persist even after the person has gone. And this is a profound belief and a profound kind of religion that needed no priest to validate it, and needed no holy books to justify it, and needed no elaborate theologies to support it, and it was believed by the people who practiced it as firmly and as deeply as any person today believes in their faith. and that belief was expressed not in words or writing, but in action, and in the careful placement of the dead, and in the gifts placed at their sides, and in the colours rubbed into their skin, and in the flowers scattered over their graves. So now the question becomes not, when did humans invent religion, but rather when did humans become conscious? And when did humans begin to understand themselves as beings who existed in time, and who would inevitably die, and who existed in relation to others, and who would feel the pain of loss when those others died? And the answer is that this understanding goes back at least 100,000 years, and possibly much further, and it is written in the archaeology of burial, and it is visible to anyone who has the eyes to see, and the heart to understand what those ancient people were trying to tell us across the span of time that separates us from them. You're sitting by a fire 3,000 generations before anyone built a temple, before anyone wrote a prayer, before anyone even had a word for God. The night is absolute. Stars are everywhere above you, more stars than you've ever seen, because there's no light pollution, no electric glow, just the pure dark of an ancient sky. And somewhere in the darkness beyond your small circle of light, somewhere out there in the black, someone has died. Not someone distant or removed. Someone you knew. Someone you touched. Someone whose absence changes the shape of your world. Someone who was here yesterday and is not here today. What do? What does your mind do when confronted with this absence? Your hands know before your conscious mind does. You gather soil. You gather stones. You gather wood. You dig. Your community gathers around you. They understand without words what is happening. This is a moment that transcends any individual's grief. This is a moment that belongs to everyone. But here's the part that changes everything. You don't just place the body in the ground. You don't just cover them and walk away. You place something else there too. Something coloured. Something that glows. Red ochre. A brilliant crimson powder that stains your hands, that paints their skin, that covers everything in the grave like liquid life poured over the body. Like you're trying to return them to the womb. Like you're trying to give them blood back, give them heat back, give them the vital essence they've lost. Red ochre appears in burials from every continent, every time period, every culture that ever learned to bury their dead. From 100,000 years ago in African caves in South Africa, to 10,000 years ago in Australian Aboriginal sites along the coast, to 5,000 years ago in European Neolithic graves scattered across fields and hillsides. Nobody taught anyone this. No trade routes carried this knowledge from one place to another. No religion demanded it, because no religion existed. They all arrived at the same answer independently, across impossible distances and across deep time. How is that possible? How do separate human populations, never having contact with each other, all decide that death requires red? All decide that red means something? All decide that red is the answer. Red equals blood. Blood equals life. So if you coat your dead in red, maybe you're giving life back. Maybe you're saying, this person was alive, was full of blood and movement and thought and laughter and pain, and I refuse to accept that this is the end. I refuse to accept that they've simply vanished. The ochre is your protest against death itself. It's your first act of defiance against the darkness. It's your way of saying, no, not yet, wait, come back. Archaeologists have found red ochre in graves so old that we struggle to even comprehend the numbers. At a site called Panga Yasidi in Kenya, deep in the African continent where humans first evolved, they discovered ochre-stained bones buried deliberately, carefully, 95,000 years ago. That's 95,000 years. That's before modern humans even left Africa. At Qafzeh Cave in Israel, skeletons lay beneath layers of red ochre 60,000 years in the past. At Lake Mungo in Australia, the oldest known cremation in the world, the oldest evidence anywhere of a human burning their dead, shows the same signature. Red ochre mixed with the ashes of the dead, as if the colour persists even in fire. Every single culture that knew how to bury their dead, and many that didn't, knew about red ochre. It wasn't random, it wasn't accidental. It wasn't something that happened because nobody was paying attention. It was deliberate, intentional, meaningful. Archaeologists believe that red ochre had to have been specially collected, specially prepared, specially transported to the grave. You had to go out and find it. It doesn't grow everywhere. You had to know where to look. You had to gather it, pack it, carry it with you to the burial site. You had to want it there. You had to make an effort to get it. You had to choose to use it. That choice matters because it proves consciousness. It proves intention. It proves that these people weren't just disposing of a body like you might discard something broken. They were performing a ritual. They were expressing something that had no survival benefit, no evolutionary advantage, no practical purpose whatsoever. And yet they did it anyway, over and over, for thousands of generations, for 100,000 years. For as long as humans have been burying their dead, they've been using red. This is the moment when we have to admit that something fundamental shifted in the human brain, something that had nothing to do with tools or weapons or hunting techniques, something that had everything to do with meaning, something that had to do with consciousness itself, recognizing its own existence and its own finitude. But the red ochre was only the beginning, because the dead weren't just covered in pigment. They weren't just coloured and then forgotten. They were given things, real objects, precious things that required time and skill and resources to create. Archaeologists call these grave goods, and they tell a story about love that reaches across 100,000 years and breaks your heart when you think about it too long. At a site called Sungir in Russia, about 34,000 years ago, 2 children were buried head to head like they were sleeping, like they were curled up together waiting for the warmth of morning that would never come. They were small, maybe 8 or 10 years old, and they were surrounded by over 10,000 mammoth ivory beads. 10,000 beads. Let that number sink in for a moment. 10,000. Each one of those beads would have taken an hour to make. Each bead required selecting the right piece of ivory from a mammoth tusk, shaping it, piercing it carefully so it wouldn't crack, polishing it until it gleamed in whatever light they had. 1 bead per hour. 1 single bead per hour. That's 10,000 hours of labour. That's more than a year of full-time work. That's years of work spread across the community. That's the accumulated effort of an entire village, spent on burying 2 children. When archaeologists excavated the grave carefully, painstakingly, using brushes and dental picks to preserve everything, they found that each bead was nearly identical to the others, suggesting a single craftsperson or a small group working over a very long time. These weren't quick graves thrown together in haste when death came suddenly. These weren't convenient disposals of inconvenient bodies. Someone spent years, literally years, making beads specifically for these burials. Someone planned for the day these children would need to be buried. Someone made a choice about where their limited time and resources would go, and they chose to make beautiful things for the dead. They made beauty for the dead, they made beauty for death. They made beauty for people who would never see it. This is love. This is grief so profound that it transforms you. This is proof of something happening in the human mind that we still don't fully understand even today. What were they doing? What were they thinking as they shaped each bead? What does it mean to spend years of your life decorating the grave of a dead child? Some archaeologists think the beads were meant as spiritual currency, objects that would be valuable in an afterlife, a way of ensuring the children were wealthy and important in whatever came next. Others think they were expressions of status, ways of showing that these children mattered more than others, that they deserved to be remembered as important even in death. Still others believe they were simply offerings of beauty, acknowledgements that death demands the most beautiful things we can make. But maybe, and this is the interpretation that makes the most sense when you really think about it, they were doing it because they couldn't not do it. Because their grief was so immense that it demanded an outlet. Because their love for the dead required physical expression. Because saying goodbye to someone you love is so painful that you need to do something, anything, to honour them. You need to make your love visible. You need to turn your grief into action. You need to spend hours shaping ivory because sitting still and accepting the loss is impossible. When we find these graves, we're not finding evidence of organised religion. We're not finding prayers carved in stone or prophecies or theological concepts written on bones. We're finding evidence of the human heart confronting the impossible fact of death. We're finding evidence of people who loved each other so much that they couldn't just let go. They had to do something. They had to make it mean something. They had to leave a mark on the world that said, this person was here, this person mattered, this person was loved, and their absence is a wound that we carry. And this is where it gets strange. Because the dead weren't just buried. They weren't just covered in earth and forgotten. They were given gifts. They were adorned with colours that represented blood and life. They were surrounded by objects of beauty and value. They were treated not as gone but as transformed, not as ended but as continuing in some way, not as lost but as honoured and remembered. The grave goods tell us about the daily lives of these ancient people too. At Neanderthal sites in Europe, archaeologists have found evidence of flowers in burials. Pollen from wildflowers has been preserved in the soil around Neanderthal skeletons at sites like Shanidar Cave in Iraq, suggesting that mourners deliberately placed flowers on the bodies. Flowers die quickly. They have no practical purpose. You can't eat them. You can't use them as tools. They don't provide shelter or warmth. The only reason to place them in a grave is because they're beautiful, and because beauty matters when you're mourning. Beauty matters when you're saying goodbye. Beauty is how you show someone they mattered. At a site in France called La Chapelle-aux-Saints, excavations revealed that a Neanderthal man, approximately 40 years old, was buried with careful attention paid to his position. His body was arranged respectfully in a shallow pit. His head was positioned on his arms like he was sleeping or resting, like he might wake up. There's no evidence of violence that would have killed him, no evidence of an accident that left him broken and bleeding. He was old, probably in pain from arthritis and the accumulated damage of a hard life, and his community chose to bury him with care and consideration and respect. This tells us something important. These beings understood dying. They understood that life wasn't infinite. They understood that time ran out. They understood that death was coming. And they responded with tenderness. They responded with love. The human consciousness is deeply shaped by the awareness of mortality. You become human the moment you understand that you will die, and the moment you understand that you will die, you begin to grieve, not for others initially, but for yourself. You begin to mourn your own inevitable ending. You begin to build defences against that knowledge. You begin to create meaning as a way of refusing to accept that death is the end. Some researchers point to something called terror management theory. The theory suggests that much of human culture, religion, art, philosophy, architecture, literature, civilization itself, is a defense mechanism against the awareness of death. Think about it. Every religion in the world offers an answer to what happens after death. Every culture throughout history has rituals around death and dying. Every human society has created myths and stories and ceremonies asserting that death is not the end. Every civilization has built monuments, temples, pyramids, cathedrals meant to last forever. Terror management. Theory suggests this isn't coincidental. It's fundamental. It's wired into our consciousness. The fear of death is so profound in human consciousness that we've built our entire civilization as a response to it. We've built it as a way of denying death, transcending death, giving meaning to death. And if that's true, if that theory is correct, then burial is where it all started. Burial is the first evidence of humans saying, I know I will die. I see death in others. I feel death coming for me. And I'm going to do something about it. I'm going to mark this moment. I'm going to say that you mattered. I'm going to leave something behind that says you existed. I'm going to transform death into meaning. I'm going to refuse to accept the universe's indifference. At a burial site in the Caucasus region, near what is now Russia and Georgia, archaeologists found skeletons dating back 50,000 years decorated with shell beads arranged in careful patterns. The shells came from the sea, from places requiring days of travel. Someone journeyed to the coast, collected shells, brought them back to the burial site, arranged them in patterns on the body. This wasn't efficiency. This wasn't necessity. This was art. This was love made visible. This was proof that you would go to the end of the world to honour someone you lost. In Australia, evidence suggests Aboriginal peoples have been burying their dead with intention and care for at least 35,000 years. They've been doing it longer than Europe has had human habitation. They understood the sacred nature of death so completely that they built entire spiritual systems around it. They understood that death was sacred. The treatment of the dead became one of the most important aspects of their culture and identity. When you look at the oldest burial sites in the world, you find the same pattern repeating like a heartbeat. Red ochre, grave goods, careful positioning of the body, flowers placed thoughtfully, shells and beads, precious stones, tools that the dead person loved and used, ornaments and jewellery that showed their status in life. Everything suggests these people understood death not as an ending, but as a transition. They understood you could keep someone alive in memory, in honour, in the physical objects you left with them. This is the birth of meaning-making. This is consciousness recognizing itself and saying, I am here, and I will not disappear without being remembered. Looking at these ancient graves, we have to ask ourselves, what changed in the human brain that made this possible? How did consciousness evolve to where we could contemplate our own death? Where did self-awareness come from? Why do we alone among all animals understand that we will die? The answer is complicated and not entirely understood by scientists even today, but many believe it relates to the development of language and abstract thought. Language gave humans the ability to represent the future in their minds. Language allowed them to say, this will happen, or this could happen, or someday I will die. Language created time in the human mind. Before language, there was only now, only the immediate moment, only the sensations directly in front of you. Animals live in an eternal present. They don't think about tomorrow, they don't plan for next year. They don't understand that eventually they will cease to exist. But with language came the past and the future. With language came the ability to imagine scenarios that hadn't happened yet. With language came the ability to imagine your own death. And once you could imagine your own death, you could no longer be at peace. You had to find a way to deny it, transcend it, give it meaning. Some anthropologists believe that elaborate burial practices may have actually accelerated the development of language and abstract thinking. The ritual around death requires language to describe it, explain it, pass it down to the next generation. It requires abstract concepts like honor, respect, memory, legacy, and the future. It requires the ability to think symbolically about things that don't exist physically in front of you. Red ochre doesn't literally give life back, but it symbolically represents the idea of giving life back. And symbolic thinking, abstract thinking, is the foundation of human consciousness. So burial practices didn't just emerge from consciousness, they may have actually shaped consciousness. They may have driven the evolution of human thought by requiring us to solve the problem of death. Every culture that develops elaborate burial rituals also develops language, art, and eventually religion. There's a connection there. The need to honor the dead drives the development of civilization itself. The rituals become more complex, the language becomes more sophisticated, the art becomes more refined, and with each generation, human consciousness deepens. And this is where it gets strange, because the dead weren't just buried, they weren't just covered in earth and forgotten, they were given gifts. They were adorned with colours that represented blood and life. They were surrounded by objects of beauty and value. They were treated not as gone but as transformed, not as ended but as continuing in some way, not as lost but as honoured and remembered. Consider what this means. Consider the moment when a grave was sealed. The person you loved was placed in the ground. You poured red ochre over them. You placed the beads you spent 1,000 hours making. You arranged the shells you journeyed to the coast to collect. You placed flowers that would wilt and decompose. You placed the tools they loved. And then you covered them with earth. And then you left. But they weren't gone. They were still there. They still existed in the ground. They still existed in the objects you left with them. They still existed in your memory. They still existed in your grief. Death didn't take them completely. Death transformed them. Death moved them from the physical world into the world of memory and ritual. The grave became sacred ground. The burial site became a place you would return to. The dead became ancestors. And ancestors are powerful. Ancestors are present. Ancestors can be communicated with through ritual. This is the beginning of religion. Not organized religion with priests and doctrines, but something deeper. This is spirituality emerging from the need to stay connected to those we've lost. This is the human capacity to create meaning in the face of meaninglessness. When you really think about it, when you really sit with the implications, it's stunning. 100,000 years ago, people were engaging with death in a way that shows they understood something about themselves and the universe that we still grapple with today. They understood finitude. They understood loss. They understood that meaning had to be created, not found. They understood that the universe doesn't care about us. The universe is vast and indifferent and doesn't know we exist. The universe will continue after we die. Stars will burn out. Galaxies will drift apart. And we will be gone. And they understood that the best way to create meaning was to gather together as a community and say, this person mattered, and we will make sure they're remembered. This is the deepest human impulse. This is the thing that makes us human. Not tool-making, not hunting, not language by itself. But the combination of all these things focused on one question. How do we face death? How do we acknowledge that everything ends? How do we love something enough to let it go, but remember enough to keep it alive? These ancient peoples didn't have religion. They didn't have priests or temples or organized belief systems, but they had something deeper. They had ritual. They had community. They had the understanding that when someone dies, the way you respond matters. The way you honor them matters. The way you choose to remember them shapes not just your grief, but your own consciousness. The people who gathered around the grave were changed by the act of burying. They were changed by the ritual. They were changed by the commitment they made to remember. And maybe that's the most important thing we can learn from these ancient graves. That the real religion, the real spirituality, isn't about belief. It's about showing up. It's about gathering together in the presence of death and saying, I see you, I acknowledge you. Your existence was meaningful, and I will carry your memory forward. It's about the ritual. It's about the community. It's about the commitment to remember. These ancient people spent 100,000 years perfecting this ritual. They travelled to the ends of the earth to collect shells. They spent years making beads. They dyed bodies in colour. They placed flowers in graves. They arranged bodies with care, over and over, generation after generation. Because the ritual mattered. Because the act of honouring the dead mattered. Because refusing to accept death mattered. And maybe, just maybe, that's what separated us from other animals. Not our ability to make tools, not our ability to hunt, but our ability to understand that we will die, and to transform that terror into meaning, to transform that grief into beauty, to transform that loss into ritual, to transform that mourning into civilization. Think about what happens in your brain when you understand that you will die. Your entire perspective changes. You begin to ask different questions. You begin to wonder about purpose. You begin to wonder about legacy. You begin to wonder, why am I here? What does my existence mean? What will I leave behind? What will people remember about me? These aren't practical questions. They don't help you catch food or build shelter or survive the night. But they become overwhelming. They consume your thoughts. They drive your behavior. They motivate you to do things that don't make sense from a survival perspective. You paint graves with ochre. You make 10,000 beads. You journey to the coast to collect shells. You place flowers on bodies. You spend time on rituals that won't help you survive. But they help you mean something. They help you matter. And that becomes more important than survival. This is the moment when consciousness became a curse. The moment when we became aware of our own mortality. The moment when we could no longer just live. We had to understand our life. We had to give it meaning. We had to fight against the terrible knowledge that eventually we will be gone. This awareness, this knowledge, this terrible understanding that death is inevitable. It appears in burials from the oldest human societies we've ever discovered. There's no record of humans ever not dealing with death this way. There's no archaeological evidence of a culture that ignored the dead. There's no society that just left bodies where they fell and moved on. Even the oldest, most primitive cultures we've found treated death as something sacred, as something that required ritual, as something that demanded meaning. This suggests that becoming aware of death is not a late development in human consciousness. It's not something that comes only after we've developed complex language and sophisticated society. It seems to come early. It seems to be almost built into the structure of human awareness. When we developed the ability to predict the future, we simultaneously developed the ability to predict our own death. When we developed consciousness, we developed the awareness of our own finitude. They arrive together. They're inseparable. You can't have one without the other, and from the moment we gained this knowledge, we've been trying to deny it. We've been trying to escape it. We've been trying to give it meaning. We build monuments. We create art. We write stories. We have children. We accumulate wealth. We seek fame. We pursue power. All of these things are ways of saying, I was here, I mattered, I will not be forgotten. Look at how much of human civilization is devoted to denying death. Every religion is devoted to it. Every artwork is devoted to it. Every achievement is devoted to it. We spend our entire lives building things meant to outlast us. We write books that will be read after we're dead. We build buildings that will stand for centuries. We have children who will carry our DNA and our memories. We create legacies. We create meaning. All of this is a response to the knowledge that we will die. And it all started in those ancient graves, with red ochre, with beads, with flowers, with careful burial and ritual and community gathering. The moment we learned to bury our dead with meaning, we began to build civilization. We began to create culture. We began to transcend our animal nature. We began to become human. This is the truth about death and human consciousness. We don't exist despite death. We exist because of death. Death is the thing that makes us human. Death is the thing that makes meaning possible. If we lived forever, nothing we did would matter. If nothing ended, everything would be the same. But because our time is limited, what we do matters, whom we love matters, what we create matters, how we treat each other matters. And that knowledge, that terrible, wonderful knowledge, it emerged in a grave 100,000 years ago. A grave covered in red ochre. A grave containing objects of beauty. A grave that said, "You mattered, and we will remember you." That grave is the birth of human civilization. That moment is when we became human. You settle deeper into the fire's warmth as the flames dance before us, and I tell you something few people consider. We are not the only creatures who mourn death. Across the African savanna, stretching for hundreds of miles under endless sky, when an elephant dies, something awakens in the herd that we cannot easily name or categorize. The matriarch falls to her knees beside the body, touching it with her trunk in movements almost choreographed by grief itself. She traces the skeleton, bone by bone, returning to it again and again, over months and years, and sometimes decades. The entire herd approaches the bones with a kind of ceremony we can only describe as sacred, as spiritual, as more than mere biology. Feet shuffle slowly across the dust in processional formation. The matriarch reaches out with her trunk, extending it fully toward the skull with deliberate slowness. She touches the jaw with tenderness almost holy, examining it as if looking for signs of life. She traces the empty sockets where eyes once saw this landscape, saw her, saw everything she has ever known. Other elephants gather nearby without speaking, ears drooping low, breathing slowly through their trunks in unison. They stand vigil in silence that speaks volumes louder than any cry or trumpet call. This is not mere instinct driving action forward. This is something deeper, something consciousness recognizes as kin to grief, and memory and love transcending death. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives separated from us by mere genetic fractions, carry dead infants for days or weeks through the forest canopy, refusing to let go as the body decays and attracts insects and begins to smell with the unmistakable odour of dissolution. The mother walks through dense jungle with her deceased child cradled against her chest, dark fur matted and soaked with fluids of death, sometimes placing it gently on a branch to rest, sometimes lifting it again, hoping warmth might spark life back into small limbs that will never move. Grooming continues even as body stiffens and rigor mortis sets in. The mother grooms the dead infant as if refusing to accept what death means, as if her care and attention might somehow reverse the irreversible. The troop watches in proximity, other mothers and young ones gathering close. They do not scatter or flee from death. They do not hide the body as other animals do to avoid predators. Something inside them knows this moment matters, that witness is required, that absence cannot be ignored or forgotten. Crows gather around a dead crow in what observers have called a funeral, and it is perhaps the most haunting of these behaviours witnessed in Animal Kingdom. Hundreds or thousands descend on the corpse from the sky in waves of black wings beating hard, creating chaos of feathers and movement and cacophony. They call out in loud, harsh cries that pierce the air like warnings or laments or accusations against death itself. They hop and strut around the body in what seems like ritual procession. They seem agitated, almost angry at what death has done to one of their own. Then, after time passes, sometimes minutes, sometimes hours, they disperse together, flying away as one unified flock in synchronized movement, leaving the body behind in solitude and silence. Is this grief and mourning? Is it processing shock of death? Is it warning to others about mortality? Is it ritual of acceptance? The truth is, we do not fully know. Scientists puzzle over it. The line between animal death awareness and human burial is blurry. It shifts depending on which expert you ask. It is haunted by questions we may never answer, no matter how much we study and observe. But here is what we know with certainty. These animals know death is not like sleep. They know something fundamental ends when a body stops moving. They know the dead deserve something more than indifference or casual disposal. They know this in their bones, in whatever consciousness drives them forward. So when early humans began burying their dead, perhaps over 100,000 years ago in caves and shelter sites, we were not inventing death awareness from nothing. We were amplifying something that lived in our deepest nature, something inherited from ancestors stretching back through time immemorial. Something in us recognized what those animals knew through their own rituals. Loss was real and permanent. The dead mattered in ways that transcended biology. Memory mattered in ways that changed us. But here is the critical question that defines humanity. When did burial transform from simple practical act into something sacred and spiritual? When did humans begin seeing the dead differently, not as disposal problems but as passages to other realms? At some point, somewhere in the darkness of caves and the scattered settlements of prehistoric peoples, humans crossed a threshold. They stopped burying the dead simply to remove the body, to keep rot and smell far from living spaces, to dispose of what had become a problem of sanitation and space. Instead, they began preparing the dead for what they believed came next. The body was no longer garbage to dispose of and forget. The body became a passenger boarding a ship sailing to somewhere else, somewhere beyond, somewhere only the dead could reach. You can see this shift clearly in the archaeological record, in the bones carefully positioned, in the objects arranged beside skeletons. Bodies were positioned facing east toward where the sun rises, where the world begins anew each morning. Bodies were curled in fetal position, as if being reborn into another world, as if death was a passage, not an ending. Food was placed beside the dead with intention. Bread and meat and fruit and water. Not for practical needs of a body that no longer eats or drinks, but for spiritual journey into whatever comes next. Weapons were placed in the grave. Tools, ornaments, jewellery, carved figurines. Shells travelled from distant seas. Ochre-red pigment was dusted across the body like a blessing, like a prayer made visible saying, "This one was loved, this one mattered, this one should not travel alone." This is when burial became more than disposal of a problem. This is when burial became religion. This is when humans first asked with full consciousness, is there something after death? You understand what I am saying. We crossed the line into faith and spirituality the moment we sent the dead away with supplies for another world. We became spiritual creatures when we lay down a body we loved and surrounded it with things that might matter where we cannot follow. The story of burial is our first great leap forward in consciousness, our first statement that we believe in something beyond what eyes can see. We built our first theology on the basis of this belief, but the story does not end in Africa. It does not stay in Paleolithic times. It spreads and transforms and becomes stranger and more elaborate as time bends forward into the future. Civilizations discover it independently. Cultures separated by oceans come to similar conclusions. The dead matter. Preparation matters. What happens after matters. Let me show you what ancient Egyptians did with their dead. Let me show you a civilization so obsessed with afterlife that they built eternal cities for the dead. They reshaped a landscape. They moved mountains of stone. They enslaved and employed hundreds of thousands to service the needs of those who had already died. Ancient Egyptians did not fear death itself. Death was natural, inevitable, understood as transition rather than ending. But they feared something else, being forgotten. They feared the journey to afterlife without proper equipment and preparation. They feared arriving in the next world unprepared, unprotected, unrecognized. So they invented mummification, the most elaborate death practice ever created by human hands. Imagine a body of someone you loved, someone you were told would live forever if you could preserve them perfectly. Egyptians understood this promise deeply. They developed a process taking exactly 70 days involving more steps than most modern manufacturing lines require. The precision was theological. The ritual was religious. First, the body arrives at the embalmer's workshop, a place smelling intensely of spices and death and determination and sweat. You notice smell first upon entry. Natron salt mixed with frankincense and myrrh, acrid and somehow sweet, overwhelming in its intensity. Embalmers were priests and technicians both, not mere craftsmen but religious specialists trusted with sacred transformation of mortal flesh into eternal form. They wore linen masks filtering air through cloth. They worked methodically and reverently, following procedures refined over centuries, procedures written down in sacred texts and taught from master to apprentice through years of training. The first act was brutal and essential and necessary. A long iron hook inserted carefully through nostril, breaking deliberately through bone and delicate membrane separating nasal cavity from cranial cavity. The hook twisted and probed within the skull, scraping and extracting brain in pieces fragment by fragment, draining out what Egyptians considered waste. Brain was considered worthless by Egyptian understanding of body and soul. It was waste product of death. It was matter without purpose or spiritual significance in afterlife. So out it came, leaving an empty space inside the skull, a hollowed chamber that once contained all thoughts and dreams and fears and memories of a person now dead. Brain was discarded into waste heap without ceremony. What mattered was heart, the seat of intelligence and memory and soul, according to Egyptian belief system developed over generations. Brain was simply meat that would rot and decay and become worm-filled. The heart was different in nature. The heart held everything that made a person themselves, their essence, their individuality. So out the brain came in pieces while heart remained in body, protected within, necessary for next world. Next came organ removal through an incision cut deliberately along the left side of the abdomen, cut made with bronze knife and steady hand. Embalmers pulled out intestines yard after yard, long loops of tissue that had processed food during life. They removed stomach that had digested 1,000 meals. They removed liver that had filtered impurities from blood. They removed lungs already darkened by death's approach, no longer pink but grey and heavy with fluids. These organs would be placed into canopic jars, 4 jars decorated with protective heads of gods watching over preserved organs. Jar with jackal head held intestines, associated with god Imseti. Jar with baboon head held lungs, associated with god Hapi. Jar with human head held liver, associated with god Duamutef. Jar with hawk head held stomach, associated with god Kebehsenef. Each jar was sealed carefully and placed in tomb beside the mummy for eternity. Heart alone remained in body, cradled safely in its cavity, in its original resting place. Egyptians believed heart was true center of being, where memory and personality and soul resided after death. Without heart, even in most elaborate afterlife, you were incomplete, unable to function, unable to recognize yourself or be recognized. So heart stayed while body was meticulously covered in natron salt, white crystalline mineral extracted from dried lake beds where ancient seas had evaporated, salt that was worth as much as precious metals in some periods. Over 40 days, natron drew out moisture from corpse with patient inevitability. It prevented rot completely and permanently. It prevented decay and decomposition. It transformed body into preserved thing that might last for eternity, might withstand sand and time and the passage of centuries and millennia. Body was monitored regularly. Salt was changed as it became saturated with bodily fluids. After 40 days, body was cleaned of salt residue and wrapped in linen, layer after layer of cloth soaked in resin and oil, creating cocoon of protected flesh. Amulets were placed between layers with care. Spells were written on cloth in hieroglyphic script, words of immense power designed to protect deceased in afterlife. These were words that had been tested through generations. These words had proven their effectiveness. Face was painted with makeup. Eyes were lined with kohl, creating expression of alertness and awareness. False beard was attached if person had been powerful or royal. Person was dressed for eternity, prepared for journey through halls of judgment, past creatures of darkness and temptation, toward kingdom of peace and eternal rest. All of this took 70 days. All of this required hundreds of workers. All of this cost immense wealth that only richest families could bear. Only wealthiest and most powerful could afford true mummification with all its rituals and materials. For ordinary people, the process was simplified, shortened, accomplished with less elaborate ingredients. The wealthy were buried in tombs, inside sarcophagus, inside pyramid structures that rose from desert like monuments to defiance against time and death itself. These structures were meant to last forever. They were filled with treasures and supplies for afterlife. They were inscribed with spells and maps showing pathways through underworld. Greatest pyramids took decades to construct and consumed labour of thousands upon thousands. Builders worked in shifts. Men died building monuments to the dead. But here is a crucial thing most people do not realize. Egyptians were not first to mummify their dead. They perfected mummification but did not invent it. Before pyramids, before pharaohs, before Egypt was even Egypt, people along Nile and across Sahara were developing sophisticated burial practices. They mummified dead using similar techniques but different materials. Some wrapped bodies in hides, some used different herbs and salts, some left bodies exposed to sun to naturally desiccate under heat. Impulse came before technique. Belief in afterlife came before elaborate machinery. Egypt industrialized it, turned it into system, into theology, into reason for existence. But core idea came from somewhere older, deeper in consciousness. It came from same impulse that moved earliest humans to place food beside dead. It came from same question haunting all cultures. What happens next? Not all cultures answered with elaborate preservation and mummification. Some saw body as merely shell, vessel that soul would vacate leaving it behind. People of Tibetan highlands practiced sky burial, tradition predating Buddhism by centuries, rooted in earlier animistic beliefs about relationship between body and spirit. In sky burial, body is taken to mountaintop, to sky burial site that is sacred ground hallowed by centuries of practice. These sites are sacred spaces where many bodies have been left over centuries, creating thin places between worlds where living meets dead. Body is naked or wrapped only in simple cloth, treated without elaborate ceremony but with profound respect and intention. There are no graves dug into frozen earth. There are no tombs constructed from stone. There are no monuments built to mark location. There is only open space and wind and vast sky overhead, like cathedral made by gods themselves, like church built without walls. Monks chant prayers over body before departure, mantras designed to guide soul through intermediate state between death and rebirth, words spoken with intention accumulated through centuries of practice. Chanting continues until soul releases, until monk sense moment of departure. Then bodies left in silence and solitude on stone platform exposed to elements. And vultures come as they always will come with reliability of sunrise. Hundreds or thousands wheel down from sky like dark leaves falling upward in spiral descent. They descend with efficiency and purpose, honed by generations of birds knowing their role in cycle. They strip flesh from bones with systematic precision and complete thoroughness. They consume body completely, nothing wasted, nothing rejected, nothing left behind. Flesh returns to earth through birds, soul has already departed to next life. Body was empty vessel, and now is empty in truth and fact. This is not disrespect or abandonment, or this is opposite of disrespect. This is profound recognition that person has already left body, that body is not person anymore, that holding on to body is holding on to thing that no longer contains one we loved. Sky receives dead gratefully. Birds receive body as sustenance. Circle continues unbroken through time. In world where Western culture thinks living should keep dead close and locked away beneath earth, protected and preserved, sky burial seems radical and strange. It seems like abandonment and disrespect. But Tibetan understanding is fundamentally different from Western understanding. They see burial underground as selfish, as refusal to let go, as keeping dead trapped in earth when soul needs to be free. To release body to sky is to release soul to next journey. To return body to vultures is to acknowledge that person is gone and body is now only matter. But the strangest burial practice isn't in any of the places you'd expect. It is not in deserts or mountains. It is not in remote temples or hidden valleys. It is beneath streets of a major European city, under buildings where children play and people work and lovers meet every single day. Catacombs of Paris hold remains of 6 and 7 million people, stacked carefully in galleries stretching for miles beneath city streets in organized chaos. You can visit them now if you dare descend into darkness below. You descend staircases carved from stone centuries ago by workers who knew they were building monuments to death. You enter tunnels smelling of earth and age and something else, something indefinable and slightly wrong. Then you see them, walls made entirely of bones, thigh bones arranged in crosses and patterns with mathematical precision and deliberate design, skulls stacked in pyramids and arches like building blocks, femurs woven into geometric designs and heraldic crests of families, entire walls of bone, creating mosaic of death stretching nearly 2 kilometers through stone passages and chambers. It is one of most haunting arrangements of human remains ever created by human hands. Walking through galleries, you feel weight of all those people pressing down. You feel presence of absence. You feel smallness of your own life against vastness of death accumulated underground. Catacombs began as quarries where limestone was extracted for building Paris above, creating hollows and passages underground. Over centuries, as Paris grew upward, underground became solution to problem growing more urgent. Where do you put 6 million dead when space runs out in cemeteries? In late 18th century cemeteries were overflowing dangerously with bodies buried too close together. Disease was spreading through, living from contaminated groundwater and soil. Air smelled like putrefaction, and death and sickness permeating neighbourhoods. Solution was simple and dark and practical. Move dead underground into former quarries beneath city. Beginning in 1786, workers moved remains from overcrowded cemeteries into quarries below ground. They placed bones with care and intention, arranging them in patterns to create walls. One wall reads in French words that echo through centuries, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here," a quotation from Dante's Inferno, reminder of underworld journey. Walking through catacombs, you understand something crucial about Paris and about yourself. Death is not hidden in Paris. It is beneath every street. It is under your feet while you walk. It is in bones beneath buildings where you shop and eat and live your life. In Eastern Europe there is another ossuary, another cathedral built entirely from bones arranged with artistic intent. Church of Sedlec, located in Kutna Hora, Czech Republic, is perhaps most elaborate bone church ever constructed by human hands in pursuit of beauty. Inside church, bones have been assembled into chandeliers hanging from ceiling with intricate craftsmanship. They form coat of arms of nobility showing status and hierarchy. They decorate walls in intricate patterns of astonishing beauty mixed with memento mori. Chandelier made entirely from bones hangs above altar with dozens of light fixtures, containing at least one bone of every type in human skeleton, demonstrating knowledge of anatomy and desire to honour all parts equally. Altar sits before walls decorated with intricate bone patterns and designs, creating visual tapestry of mortality. Local artist named František Rint created much of decor in 1870s with obsessive dedication, assembling approximately 70,000 remains into artistry both beautiful and deeply disturbing simultaneously. It is a place where aesthetic and mortality merge completely and cannot be separated from each other. You cannot look at chandeliers without thinking about hands that arranged them. You cannot see bone coat of arms without thinking about spines and ribs and fingers that once belonged to people with names and lives and loves and dreams. In Zoroastrianism, one of the world's oldest religions predating most others by centuries, treatment of dead reflected ancient belief in purity and sacred elements. Corpse was considered unclean, polluted by death, infected by forces of decay and entropy and corruption. To bury would pollute earth, one of the sacred elements representing foundation and stability. To burn would pollute fire, another sacred element representing divine light and purity. To leave body and water would pollute water, sacred element representing flow and renewal. So Zoroastrians built towers, called Towers of Silence or Dakmas, with flat roofs open to sky and air. Body was brought to tower and laid on stone platform in public ceremony, with prayers and ritual. Their body was exposed to sun, wind, vultures and birds of prey with ritual formality and respect. Flesh would be stripped from bones by scavenging birds over days as part of natural cycle. Bones would eventually be disposed carefully in ways that did not pollute earth or fire or water. Towers of Silence represented understanding that death was transformation, not ending but phase in which body returns to elements through birds. This practice continued for thousands of years in ancient Persia and beyond, and is still performed by some Zoroastrian communities today in India and Iran, though increasingly rare as cities expanded and modern sensibilities changed attitudes toward death. These burial practices, separated by continents and centuries and religions and belief systems, share common thread running through all of them. They all represent attempts to answer what happens after death, what we believe occurs in mysterious space after breath stops. They all say in different ways that body matters even after a person has left it, that physical form deserves respect. They all insist that how we treat dead reflects how we understand life itself, what we value, what we fear. They all ask profound question. What do we owe to the people who came before us, who are now gone? In silence of night, in warmth of this fire, sitting together in darkness listening to crackling flames, you might ask yourself, what does your culture's burial practice say about how you understand death and what comes after? What are we saying when we lower a body into ground and cover it with earth? What are we saying when we burn a body to ash and watch smoke rise to sky? What are we saying when we scatter ashes to wind or water or air, releasing them to elements? The answers reveal who we are and what we believe about what matters in this world and what might matter in worlds we cannot see. Every culture answers this question differently. Every culture reveals through burial practices what they fear, what they hope for, what they know and do not know. When you walk among graves and monuments of dead, you're reading history of human consciousness written in bone and stone and ash. You're seeing theology made physical. You're standing in places where people like you stood and asked the same question. Where does it go? Where do we go when the heart stops beating? These burial practices across all peoples and all times point to one universal truth. We are the only creatures who know we will die, and we are the only creatures who have tried to answer what happens next. That knowledge has defined us since the beginning. That knowledge made us human. This is the story we tell around fires. This is the knowledge we pass down through generations. This is the mystery that unites us all. Picture yourself standing at the edge of a Viking settlement in 9th century Norway, the wind carrying the salt smell of the sea across dark pine forests, and you witness something that will echo through the centuries, a ship burial. Not a small boat, not a raft, but an entire longship being prepared as a tomb. The vessel that carried warriors across violent seas is now being carried onto shore, pulled by dozens of people toward a prepared burial site. This is not a practical solution to the problem of death, and that is precisely the point. The Vikings could have buried their dead in the ground. They could have burned the bodies on a simple funeral pyre. Instead, they chose to destroy wealth, to obliterate resources, to bury entire ships with the corpses of their most important people. A warrior chief does not lie alone in that ship. He is surrounded by weapons he will never use again, by armor that will rust in the soil, by horses that have been killed specifically for this moment, sometimes by slaves who were executed so they could serve their master in the afterlife. When you think about what the Vikings were doing, it becomes clear that they understood something profound about death and meaning and status. To bury a ship was to announce to the world that this person mattered so much that their community was willing to sacrifice real wealth for them. The grave goods were not a gift to the dead, not really. They were a statement made by the living. They were a way of saying, this person was significant, this person was powerful, this person deserved sacrifice. The Oseberg ship, discovered in Norway in 1904, gives us an almost perfect window into this practice. The ship was enormous, nearly 70 feet long, with a dragon-head prow that curved skyward like the claw of a mythical beast, and it had been sealed in a burial mound for more than 1,000 years. Inside were not one but 2 women, and the questions surrounding them still puzzle archaeologists today. Was one a queen, and the other her servant, both buried together in death as they had been bound together in life? Were they priestesses of some kind, women of such power that they merited the destruction of an entire ship, and the sacrifice of animals and other humans? The speculation has continued for over a century. The Oseberg tomb contained textiles so elaborate and well preserved that museums still use them as reference standards for Viking weaving. There were wooden carts carved with intricate designs, sleds, cooking equipment, even a Viking sleigh that would have been used for travel or ceremonial purposes. There were the remains of horses and oxen sacrificed at the moment of the burial ceremony in rituals that the Vikings believed were necessary to send the dead safely into the afterlife. All of it went into the ground, all of it was lost to the darkness and the decay, because the living believed that the dead needed these things. What kind of belief system forces you to destroy a functional ship, to kill animals, to abandon wealth that could feed your community through a harsh winter? What kind of religion or philosophy or cultural practice demands such extreme sacrifice? It is the same belief system that haunted that first human standing over a corpse in Africa 100,000 years ago. The belief that death is not an ending, but a transformation, that the dead remain present in some form, that they have needs and desires that the living must satisfy. The Oseberg women are not unique in this regard. Nor are the Vikings unique in this practice. The practice of burying entire ships with dead warriors appears throughout Scandinavian culture, from Sweden to Denmark to Norway, and it represents one of the most extreme expressions of the fundamental anxiety about death that seems to be universal among humans. In Qafzeh, another Norwegian ship burial discovered in the 19th century, archaeologists found a warrior surrounded by 12 horses, shields, swords, spears, armour, and enough food and equipment to sustain him through what the Vikings believed would be his final journey into whatever realm awaited the dead. The grave goods do not suggest that the Vikings thought the dead would eat or fight in some literal sense, though they may have believed something close to that. Rather, the objects seem to represent status, identity, and connection. By burying these items, the living are saying something essential about what the person meant to them. You mattered. You were important. Your absence is so significant that we're willing to sacrifice real resources to honour your memory. This is a statement that transcends practical concerns. This is an expression of grief so powerful that it overrides the logical need to preserve resources. And in that sense, every grave good, every ship burial, every elaborate funeral practice ever developed by any human culture is a scream of grief and loss, and the desperate desire to believe that the dead are still somehow present, still somehow listening, still somehow in need of what the living can provide. Now let us travel across the world and across more than 2,000 years of history to the tomb of a different emperor in a different civilization, but a man driven by the same fundamental anxiety about death that drove the Vikings to bury ships, and the first humans to place ochre on corpses. Qin Shi Huang unified China in 221 BC, consolidating warring kingdoms under a single rule, and he became obsessed, truly obsessed, with the question of mortality. He did not want to die. More than that, he did not want to die and leave this world. He did not want to enter some afterlife where he would be powerless and diminished. He wanted to remain eternally powerful, eternally present, eternally able to command and control. He commissioned a massive necropolis to be built outside the city of Xi'an, and the scale of the project was staggering. The Terracotta Army, as it came to be known, consists of approximately 8,000 life-sized clay soldiers arranged in military formations as if they were about to march, each one individually sculpted with different facial features, different armour, different weapons, different expressions. They were not meant to be beautiful or artistic in the way we think of sculpture today. They were not created for aesthetic appreciation. They were meant to be functional. Qin Shi Huang believed that in the afterlife he would need an army. He would need protection. He would need loyal soldiers to serve him exactly as they had served him in life. So 8,000 men were put to work creating these warriors from clay, shaping individual faces, carving individual expressions, ensuring that each soldier was unique and distinct. They were arranged in pits beneath the earth, and when the time came for the emperor to die, they were sealed in the tomb along with him. The level of detail in the terracotta soldiers is remarkable in ways that go beyond mere craftsmanship. Some soldiers smile, some look stern, some appear thoughtful. The armour varies in style and decoration. The weapons are individually crafted. It is as if the emperor wanted not just an army, but an entire society to accompany him, a full social structure that would reflect the complexity of the kingdom he had ruled. The irony of Qin Shi Huang's story is so profound that it verges on tragedy. Obsessed with immortality, he drank elixirs of mercury because he believed the toxic metal could grant him eternal life, could preserve his body forever, could make him immune to death and decay. He had alchemists work on these elixirs constantly. He believed that through the right combination of materials and the right ritual he could transcend death itself. The mercury poisoned him instead. His desperate, frantic attempts to conquer death became the instrument of his demise. He died not from old age, but from the very elixir he had hoped would save him. He was buried with 8,000 soldiers, yes, but he was buried dead, buried quickly, buried in a state of decay that no amount of terracotta warriors could prevent. The emperor who had the power to move mountains, who could command an entire nation, who could force thousands to labour on a project of impossible ambition, could not force his own body to remain alive. The emperor who had unified China through military conquest could not conquer death itself. The tomb of Qin Shi Huang is sealed to this day. Archaeologists have not excavated the central burial chamber because they believe the soil may be contaminated with mercury from the elixirs buried with him, and also because they want to preserve what remains for future generations with better technology and less risk of damage. But what we can see in the thousands of terracotta warriors tells us something that the Vikings knew and that those first humans in Africa knew. We bury our dead not because we must, but because we are trying to solve an equation that has no solution. We are trying to make sense of absence. We are trying to create permanence in the face of absolute impermanence. The Emperor understood this at some level. He understood that he could not achieve literal immortality, but by creating an army of 8,000 soldiers, by ensuring that he would be surrounded by loyal servants forever, by constructing a tomb so elaborate and so filled with grave goods that it would take decades to explore it fully, he was creating a different kind of immortality. He was creating a presence that would endure. He was ensuring that long after his body had decayed, his name would be remembered, his power would be acknowledged, and his tomb would be one of the great monuments of human civilization. Now let us descend quite literally into the ground, into the peat bogs of northern Europe, where a very different kind of preservation has occurred, and a very different story is written in preserved human flesh. Where the Vikings buried ships and Qin Shi Huang buried armies, the peat bogs of Denmark, England, Ireland and Germany have preserved human bodies in a state so complete that you can see the final moments of their lives written across their skin like ancient text. Tolland Man is perhaps the most famous. He was discovered in a peat bog in Silkeborg, Denmark in 1950, and when he emerged from the earth after more than 2,000 years, he looked like he might wake up at any moment. His skin was leather brown from the tannins in the peat, his hair was intact, his fingernails were visible, and around his neck was a leather noose. He had been strangled. The rope was still there, still around his throat, and the expression on his face was peaceful, almost serene. How can you look peaceful while being murdered? This is one of the mysteries that makes Tolland Man so unsettling to contemplate. Perhaps he was sacrificed willingly. Perhaps he had accepted his fate as a necessary sacrifice to the gods. Perhaps the act of strangulation happened so quickly that his muscles relaxed into a position that we now interpret as peaceful. Perhaps the piece on his face is an illusion created by the desiccation of his skin over centuries, a trick of the peat and time and the way his facial muscles contracted as his body was preserved. Lindo Man, discovered in a peat bog in Cheshire, England in 1984, was not peaceful. He was stabbed, struck repeatedly, throttled. His body bore the marks of violence. His stomach contents were preserved, and from them, archaeologists learned that his final meal was porridge made from barley and mistletoe. Mistletoe, a plant associated with ritual and ceremony, with magic and significance. His final meal was not ordinary food, but ceremonial food, eaten perhaps in a ritual context, eaten before the violence began, eaten as part of the ceremony that would end in his death. He was a ritual sacrifice, likely a druid or a priest of some kind, offered to the gods or to nature itself in hopes of ensuring a good harvest or preventing catastrophe. Lindo Man and Tolland Man and the dozens of other bog bodies found throughout northern Europe were not buried with wealth or armies or ships. They were not given elaborate ceremonies. They were simply left in the bog, sometimes weighted down with stones or branches, sometimes pinned beneath logs, left in the acidic anaerobic environment where the peat preserved them like amber preserving insects. The living did not build monuments for these bodies. They did not create shrines or mark graves with headstones, or establish places where future generations could come to honour the dead. And yet, the peat bog itself became a kind of temple, a place where bodies remained visible centuries after they were placed there. The bog preserved them so thoroughly that we can look directly at the face of Tolland Man. We can see the noose around his neck. We can understand with a clarity that is almost unbearable exactly how he died. The ritual that ended his life is written in his skeleton, in the marks of violence on his bones, in the contents of his final meal. And here is what troubles us. We do not actually know why he died. We do not know if he was willing or unwilling, honoured or shamed, sacrificed to ensure prosperity or punished for transgression. We do not know if his death was voluntary or forced, consented to or imposed. The bog preserved his body perfectly, but it kept his meaning hidden. This is one of the uncomfortable truths about burial and preservation. The most complete physical preservation does not grant us complete understanding. And then there are the bodies that were never meant to be found. Across cultures and across millennia, There are graves that were not constructed with the intention of being discovered, not built to communicate with posterity, not designed as messages from the past to the future. Some were hidden deliberately, sealed away intentionally, buried in unmarked places in forests or remote areas, because the society that buried them believed that certain dead were dangerous and must be contained. In medieval Europe, stakes were driven through the hearts of corpses believed to be vampires, not because anyone actually thought they were supernatural creatures in the modern sense, but because they carried disease or were believed to carry some kind of contagion that might spread to the living if the body was not neutralized. The spike through the chest was an effort to keep the dangerous dead in the ground, to prevent them from rising and spreading contamination to the community. These bodies were not meant to be monuments. They were meant to be forgotten, meant to be neutralized, meant to be rendered permanently harmless. The line between honoring the dead and containing the dead is thinner than we might think, and understanding this thin line reveals something important about how humans understand death. In many cultures, the most dangerous dead are those who died suddenly, violently, or unexpectedly. The ghost stories that haunt human tradition are almost universally about people whose deaths were wrong somehow, people who did not have proper burial, people who were denied the rituals that would allow them to transition peacefully from life to the realm of the dead. This anxiety exists even in cultures that no longer believe in literal ghosts or supernatural entities. We still feel, intuitively, that something is wrong when a body is not properly honoured, when the death is not acknowledged, when the person is not marked as gone. There is a sense that the person cannot rest unless the proper rituals have been observed. Fast forward now through the centuries, past the Vikings and past the bog bodies and past Qin Shi Huang's terracotta army, into the modern world where the question of what to do with the dead has become profoundly complicated and fraught with new choices that earlier humans never had to make. In the 19th century, burial was the dominant practice across the Western world. Families owned plots in cemeteries. Graves were marked with headstones that bore the names of the dead and the dates of their lives. The dead remained in one place, physically present in the earth, and the living could visit them, could tend to them, could place flowers on significant dates, and maintain the memory of them through physical presence. But in the 20th century, something shifted fundamentally. Cremation began to increase in popularity, slowly at first, then more rapidly. By the end of the 20th century, cremation had become the dominant practice in many developed countries. In the United States, cremation rates have climbed steadily across the past few decades, and they now exceed burial. The reasons for this shift are practical. Cremation is less expensive, it takes up less space, it is faster, and it gives families more flexibility about what to do with the ashes. There is no need for cemetery space, no need for ongoing maintenance of grave sites, no need for families to return to the same location year after year. But something was lost in this transition, something fundamental about our relationship with death and memory and place. When the dead are cremated, there is no fixed place to visit. The ashes might be scattered in a favourite location, might be placed in an urn in the home, might be divided among family members, might be mixed into reefs or released into the ocean. The dead become dispersed, mobile, less fixed in space. The physical location that would hold the memory becomes optional, becomes something that must be chosen rather than something that is automatically established. And so, new practices have emerged in response to this loss of place, new ways of keeping the dead present even when their physical remains have been transformed beyond recognition. The green burial movement has grown substantially in the past 2 decades, particularly among younger people concerned about environmental impact. A green burial returns to something closer to what ancient humans practiced, but with a modern consciousness about ecology and sustainability. Bodies are buried in simple, biodegradable caskets, without embalming chemicals, in dedicated green burial sites where the land is allowed to return to nature. Wildflowers grow over the graves, trees are planted as living memorials, the dead nourish the earth that will eventually decompose them completely. It is a reversal of the ancient practice of burying grave goods with the dead, but the impulse is similar, the desire to connect the death of the individual with the continuation of life and nature. The body is not fought against or rejected, but embraced as part of the natural cycle, and the innovations continue at a pace that would astound people from even 50 years ago. Mushroom burial suits have been developed, made of mycelium and organic materials that accelerate decomposition while using the decaying body to grow new life. The suit is inoculated with mushroom spores that break down the body as it decays, creating new fungal growth that then nourishes the soil. Alkaline hydrolysis, sometimes called water cremation, is a process where the body is placed in a heated alkaline solution that dissolves the flesh and leaves only the bones, which are then ground into a fine powder similar to the remains of traditional cremation. The alkaline solution itself can be safely returned to the water system. Turning ashes into diamonds has become an actual service, available to the wealthy. A company can take the carbon from human ashes and compress it under heat and pressure into a precious stone. Other companies will mix ashes into vinyl records so that the dead become embedded in music, literally become part of the record that people play and listen to, their physical remains transformed into sound. Other companies will mix ashes into coral reefs so that they become part of the living ocean ecosystem, so that fish swim through the remains of their ancestors, so that the dead nourish living creatures. We're still asking the same question that those first humans asked 100,000 years ago, when they placed ochre on a corpse and dug a grave in the earth of Africa. What do we do with our dead? How do we acknowledge their absence? How do we transform their physical remains into something meaningful? The methods have changed profoundly. The technologies have advanced beyond recognition. The options have multiplied, but the underlying anxiety remains identical, unchanged and unchanging across the entire span of human history. We have not solved the problem of death. We have only found new ways to describe it, new technologies to process it, new metaphors to make sense of it. The question persists even as the answers transform. The psychology of grief is universal across cultures, despite the radically different practices that emerge from the loss of a loved one. When humans grieve, they experience similar patterns of emotion, regardless of whether they are Viking warriors preparing a ship burial, Qin Shi Huang ordering the construction of clay armies, people in peat bog cultures offering sacrifices to the gods, or modern people scattering ashes in an ocean, or green burial practitioners planting trees over graves. There is the initial shock, the denial that the death has truly occurred, the sense that this cannot be real, that the person will still call or visit or be present in some way. There is the acute pain of missing the person, the strange moments when the grieving person forgets that the loved one is dead and reaches for a phone to call them, or remembers a detail they need to share before remembering they cannot share it anymore. There is the slow process of reorganizing identity around the absence, of learning to be a person who has lost someone significant, of relearning how to live without the presence that was once assumed to be permanent. And there is eventually, for most people, an integration of the loss into the ongoing story of their life. The dead do not disappear from the memory of the living even as their bodies decompose. They become different, transformed from physical presence into memory and story and influence. They shape the decisions of the living. They haunt traditions. They guide choices made by people who never knew them, but who inherited their genes, their culture, their values. The Viking practice of burying grave goods with the dead served multiple psychological functions simultaneously. It gave the living something to do in the immediate aftermath of death, which is a critical need. Grief can be paralyzing, the body cannot be left alone, the community cannot simply sit with the loss in silence. So rituals provide structure, they provide work, they provide a sense that something is being done, something is being accomplished, that progress is being made toward closure even though closure is not truly possible. The creation of grave goods also allows the living to externalize their emotional relationship to the dead. The items buried with the body represent the identity and status of the person who died. By choosing those items carefully, by selecting what will accompany the body into eternity, the living make statements about who the person was, about what they valued, about what was significant about the relationship. The weapon of a warrior tells us about power and courage. The jewelry of a woman tells us about beauty and status. The tools of a craftsperson tell us about skill and identity. Each grave good is a sentence in a story written about the dead by the living. The green burial movement serves similar psychological functions in the modern world, but it shifts the focus from material possessions to the living earth. The person organizing the funeral can participate in the decoration of the burial site, can plant trees, can ensure that something living grows from the death. The scattering of ashes over beloved landscapes allows the grieving person to return to those places and feel the presence of the dead woven into the geography they valued, woven into the landscape where memories were made. The turning of ashes into diamonds or vinyl records or coral reefs creates a kind of compromise between the demands of the modern world and the ancient impulse to keep the dead present. The dead are no longer fixed in a cemetery plot that may be neglected or destroyed, but neither are they entirely dispersed and forgotten. They are transformed into something new, something that can be held or worn or visited or listened to. The grieving person can wear a diamond made from their mother's ashes. They can play a record and hear the music knowing that the physical substance of the person they loved is there in the vinyl. They can swim above a coral reef and know that the person is present, is still nourishing life, is still contributing to the continuation of existence. These are metaphors, of course. The dead do not literally nourish the reef or know that they are being listened to. But metaphors are powerful forces. They shape how we experience loss. They give us frameworks for understanding something that is, by its nature, incomprehensible. The rituals surrounding death are not primarily about the dead at all, a difficult truth that archaeologists and grief counsellors have come to understand through research and observation. The rituals are for the living, for the grieving, for the community that must continue existing after one of its members has ended. The dead do not benefit from grave goods or ship burials or careful funeral rites. The dead are gone, their consciousness ended, their ability to experience anything completed. But the living benefit profoundly from the rituals surrounding death. The rituals mark the transition, acknowledge the significance of the person who has died, give the community a moment to gather and affirm their bonds to each other, and create a pathway for grief that channels what might otherwise be chaotic emotion into structured, meaningful action. This explains why even in societies that no longer believe in an afterlife, that do not expect the dead to need anything in some hypothetical realm beyond death, people continue to invest enormous resources in elaborate funerals, in grave goods of a sort, in elaborate rituals and ceremonies. The burial of the dead is not about the dead at all. It is about the living, about how we acknowledge absence, about how we mark transitions, about how we affirm what was important and what mattered and who we are in relation to the dead. The question that has haunted humans since the beginning of our species is not really what happens after death. The question is what happens to us, the living, when someone we know or love or care about dies. How do we adjust? How do we continue? How do we make sense of the absence that is suddenly present in our lives in such a profound way that it threatens to overwhelm us completely? And burial, in all its forms and iterations, is our answer to that question. It is imperfect. It is never adequate to the magnitude of the loss. But it is what we have. It is what we have always had. And the fact that humans 100,000 years ago asked the same question, and that modern humans still ask the same question, and that humans in every culture ever studied have asked the same question, suggests that this is a fundamental part of what it means to be human. We are the animals that bury our dead. This practice has survived every change in technology, every revolution in belief, every transformation of culture. We adapt the form, but the substance remains constant and unchanging. And as you lie in the darkness listening to these stories, as you imagine the Vikings preparing their ship, as you picture Tolland man emerging from the peat bog with the rope still around his neck, as you consider the terracotta soldiers standing eternal guard over an emperor who could not escape death, as you contemplate the modern practices of turning ashes into coral reefs and diamonds and vinyl records, you might find yourself asking the same question that all of those people asked. What will they do with me? Some of the most powerful evidence for what burial actually meant to ancient humans does not come from carefully planned tombs or intentional rituals carefully designed by societies, but from accidents of preservation, moments when the earth itself became a caretaker, freezing people in their final moments and holding them unchanged until we could find them and piece together their stories from teeth and bones and preserved tissue. Take Qafzeh, the Iceman, discovered in September 1991 emerging from melting glacial ice, high in the Alps between Austria and Italy. His body had been locked in ice for 5,300 years, perfectly preserved as if time itself had decided he deserved to be found someday by distant descendants. When researchers examined him with their modern tools, they did not just find scattered bones. They found everything intact. His leather and grass-padded shoes still wearable, the fur on his clothing preserved with its original texture, a copper axe and flint knife wrapped carefully in their sheaths, a backpack made of wood and leather, and when they opened his stomach they found the contents of his last meal, wild berries and venison and grains showing exactly what he had eaten before. Whatever happened to him occurred, But the most startling and tragic discovery came when scientists examined his back and found a flint arrowhead embedded deep between his shoulder blades. Someone had shot him with serious intent to kill. Someone had hunted him down in those high mountains and had succeeded in bringing him down, and he had died there in the cold, alone or perhaps with people who could not save him, his body gradually covered by snow and ice year after year, until he became part of the landscape itself. The fact that we know this happened at all, the fact that the arrow is still in his back after 50 centuries of freezing, tells you something crucial about Ötzi's story and about his death. It tells you that he was found eventually, that his body was not left for scavengers to tear apart and scatter, that someone came to where he fell and made a choice about what to do with his remains, and that someone was likely grieving, likely in shock, likely experiencing the weight of loss for the first time or the 10th time in their life. We do not know if they buried him or simply left him where he fell, but the ice became his burial, the glacier became his tomb, and he was preserved in a way that no intentional burial could have achieved. And 5,000 years later, we can look at him and know he was loved enough to be mourned. He was important enough to matter, and that knowledge comes from studying how he was treated, where he was left, what evidence remains of the people around him. Then consider Pompeii, the Roman city that sleeps eternally in the shadow of Mount Vesuvius. In the year 79 AD, the volcano erupted with fury beyond imagining and buried the entire city in scalding volcanic ash and pumice. In seconds, the eruption column rose miles into the sky and ash rained down, covering everything. And what happened next was not burial in the traditional sense, but something almost more haunting and intimate. The superheated pyroclastic flows, moving at tremendous speed through the streets, reached people as they fled for their lives, their bodies coated in the fine volcanic particles and ash. And over time the ash hardened into a shell around each body. And when archaeologists much later carefully and respectfully removed that ash, they found not skeletons but empty spaces where people had been. Spaces created by the decay of flesh inside the hardened ash shell. Spaces they could fill with plaster to create casts that showed exactly how these people had been positioned at the moment the volcano took their lives. What those casts reveal is devastating in its honesty and its intimacy. A mother was found holding her daughter against her body, shielding the child even as death was approaching. An entire family was discovered in a locked embrace, all of them together at the end, and men and women and teenagers were found with their arms around each other, protecting each other, facing each other, trying somehow to shield each other from the heat and the toxic fumes, and that tells you something about human nature that no philosophy could explain better. In their final moments, even in panic and terror, and the face of absolute catastrophe, people still thought about each other. They still reached for the people they loved. They were not thinking about saving themselves. They were thinking about connection. They were thinking about protecting the people around them. And that is what Pompeii preserved for us forever. Not just how people died, but the fact that they died caring about each other. Their instinct in the face of absolute catastrophe was to hold on, to reach out, to connect. And the ash preserved that instinct in ash and plaster. And we can see it now. And it reminds us that we are not so different from those people. But if you want to understand the true meaning of burial without all the complexity of power structures and religious doctrine and political control, if you want to see burial in its purest and most democratic form, you have to travel south, far south, to the coast of Chile, to the Atacama Desert where the Pacific Ocean meets the land, and there you will find the story of the Chinchorro people, a fishing community that lived and thrived on that coast 7,000 years ago. And they created the oldest intentional mummies in the entire world. Not the famous mummies of Egypt. Those came 2,000 years later. 2,000 years after the Chinchorro had already developed their sophisticated mummification practices. And here is what makes the Chinchorro story so remarkable and so deeply human. It almost breaks your heart. They did not create mummies for leaders and rulers and kings. They did not build elaborate tombs for pharaohs and nobility. They mummified everyone equally. Their entire community was entitled to the same careful preparation and preservation, without exception. And when they mummified someone, they wrapped the body carefully with reeds and textiles. They placed the mummy in a flexed position that echoed the fetal position as if returning them to the beginning. Sometimes they modelled faces from clay to replace faces that had been damaged. Sometimes they repainted bodies with pigments in geometric patterns that spoke to their cosmology and their understanding of the universe, and they created what scholars call mummy bundles, intricate packages that represented the person inside. But the astonishing part is that they mummified men and women without distinction. They mummified children, they mummified infants, they even mummified fetuses that had not yet been born. The very smallest members of their community received the same devoted care and attention, and they would place these mummified bodies in caches near their villages and return to them sometimes, tending to them, maybe repainting them, maybe adjusting them, maybe just spending time in their presence. And this practice continued for thousands of years, generation after generation making the same choice, deciding that this was the right way to honour their dead. And what this tells us is that the Chinchorro did not mummify their dead because they were afraid of a curse or because a priest demanded it. They did it because they believed their dead deserved preservation, deserved continued existence in the community, deserved to be tended to and cared for like living things deserving of attention. That impulse to care, to tend, to preserve is the deepest and most basic human impulse of all, deeper than religion, deeper than politics, deeper than survival itself. It is the impulse that says you are important to me, and I will prove it by changing my own life to honour you. And the Chinchorro understood that every person in their community mattered equally, that a child's life had the same value as an elder's, that a fetus had worth, that the community was strengthened by remembering everyone, by caring for everyone equally. And in that understanding they created something that would outlast empires and monuments. They created a perfect expression of what burial means. Now jump forward with me through thousands of years of human history, through the rise of cities and religions and science and technology, forward to the present day where the human need to honour the dead has not diminished, but has simply found new methods and new directions and new possibilities we could never have imagined. Clyde Tombaugh was born in 1906 in the American Midwest, and became an astronomer, and at age 24 in 1930 he discovered an object beyond Neptune that would be called the planet Pluto, and that discovery made him famous in the scientific world. Throughout his long life he studied the heavens, he mapped the stars, he looked deeper into space than most humans ever dared to look. He was a man whose entire existence was dedicated to reaching toward the cosmos and understanding its mysteries. When he died in 1996 at 90 years old, his family and colleagues and NASA made a decision that would have seemed like pure magic to every human who lived before this moment in history. They took a small portion of his ashes, they placed them in a container, and they loaded that container aboard the New Horizons spacecraft, a robotic probe designed to escape the solar system entirely and travel toward the stars. And now, as you listen to this story, that spacecraft is travelling through the Kuiper belt beyond the outermost planets. It is moving away from Earth at incredible speed, sailing past the dwarf planets and the ice, and somewhere in that darkness surrounded by cosmic dust and frozen comets, Clyde Tombaugh is journeying toward infinity, returning in a sense to the realm he spent his entire life studying and devoted to understanding. His body transformed into something that will travel farther than any human or any part of a human has ever travelled in all of history, sailing through a darkness that ancient peoples would have called the home of gods and spirits. And it is not really so different from what people did 100,000 years ago, when they looked up at the night sky and saw the spirits of their dead returning as stars. They were reaching toward the heavens, reaching toward something transcendent, reaching toward the hope that their loved ones continued to exist in some form beyond the grave. And Clyde Tombaugh's remains are doing exactly that. They are reaching toward the stars, literally. They are travelling through the cosmic dark. They are being honoured by being sent toward what humans have always considered sacred and infinite. Then there is Gene Roddenberry, who created the television series Star Trek, a show about exploring strange new worlds and seeking out new life and new civilizations, a vision of humanity reaching beyond Earth, expanding outward into the cosmos, becoming something greater than we were. And when he died in 1991, his ashes were launched into space aboard a satellite that orbited the Earth, and then gradually drifted back down and burned away in the atmosphere like a meteor. And the fact that this happened, the fact that this was even possible, means that the old human dream of sending the dead upward, of placing them among the stars, has become literal and real, not just metaphor but actual physics and spaceflight. You can now purchase services that will send your ashes to the moon, to orbit the Earth indefinitely, to travel into the depths of space. And this is not an uncommon choice anymore. More and more families are deciding that for their loved ones, that the ultimate journey beyond the body is also a journey beyond the Earth itself, escaping the gravity well that bound them in life, and this tells you something fundamental about what has not changed in the entire span of human history. The need to honor death is still there. The need to mark the ending of a life is still there. The need to create ritual and meaning around mortality is still there. It is just that now we have the technology to make our ancient dreams real. We can literally send our dead toward the stars. We can fulfill the dreams of our ancestors in ways they never imagined possible. Think about what this means for a moment. Really sit with it. 100,000 years ago, someone placed a body in the ground and covered it with rocks and dirt. They were saying to the universe that this person was important, that they deserved to be marked, that they would not simply vanish without acknowledgement, that their existence mattered and would be remembered. And now we have the same urge, but we are pointing it upward instead of downward. We are saying that our loved ones deserve to be sent toward the infinite, that they deserve a journey beyond this world, that their absence should be marked with something transcendent, and the underlying impulse is identical. It is the refusal to let someone simply disappear. It is the demand that their existence matter. It is the assertion that love and connection survive death, and that demand has never changed throughout all of human history, and probably never will. Here is something that separates humans from every other living creature on this planet. Something unique to our species. We know we will die. Every human being who has ever been conscious has carried the knowledge of their own mortality deep inside them. You carry it right now even if you do not think about it. You know that one day you will not exist, that the people you love will one day cease to exist, that everyone you see and everyone you meet will eventually die, and that knowledge is perhaps the heaviest burden any species has ever had to carry. It is not knowledge that makes you stronger or faster or better able to survive. It is knowledge that makes you want to flee, to deny, to pretend that death is not real, to distract yourself with anything available, and yet humans never fled from this knowledge throughout our entire history. We did not deny it or hide from it. Instead, we did something totally unexpected, something that no other species has ever done. We converted that burden into the foundation of everything we are. We created rituals around death. We created burial. We created ways to gather together and acknowledge loss, and transform grief into meaning and memory. That transformation changed everything about what it means to be human. It made possible every religion that has ever existed, every work of art, every philosophy, every monument, every system of thought about what it means to be human. All of it comes from the fact that someone at some point in our distant past decided that the appropriate response to death was not denial, but meaning-making, and that one decision created the entire architecture of human culture that we live inside. When you think about what makes us different from other animals, it is not our intelligence alone. Many animals are intelligent. It is not our ability to make tools. Many animals make tools. It is not our ability to communicate or work together. Those exist in the animal kingdom too. It is this unique ability to acknowledge death and transform that acknowledgement into something that binds us together and makes us stronger. And every human who has ever participated in a funeral or a memorial service, or who has left flowers on a grave or scattered ashes or lit a candle, is participating in that ancient transformation. You are taking the terrible knowledge of mortality and converting it into an act of love and remembrance. And that is something only humans can do. That is what makes us human at our core. Now listen carefully, because there is one more burial story, and it might be the most human of all. It is the story that is happening right now, in every town and every city on the planet, in cemeteries and forests and beaches and crematoriums and temples and churches and simple homes. It is the story of people gathering when someone dies, and choosing how to mark that death. It is the story that includes your own future someday, and the futures of everyone you love. Whenever loss comes, whenever death takes someone from the circle of your life, humans gather and they participate in a ritual that has been unchanged in its essential form for 100,000 years. Some people gather in churches or temples or mosques. Some people gather in cemeteries under trees. Some people gather in homes or community centres or public parks. Some people scatter ashes on water or